Another way to think about this, if you kind of want to know what is the distinction, think about this question. I take a single H2O molecule. Is that molecule wet? It's a single molecule of water. Is it wet? I have to say no. It's a molecule. When I start adding some more together, at which point is it wet? We have to, I guess, realize here that that word that we use, wet, is actually it's a collective. It has a collective connotation to it. So emergence describes macroscopic properties or behavior arising through the interaction of lower level entities. As I said, it arises spontaneously. It's not controlled or dictated by a central authority. So if you ever want to know, I've got a complex system, is the behavior that is arising emergent? Well, if it has a like downward causation in this way, then it's probably not emergent. But if it arises spontaneously, it is. It can arise from exceedingly simple rules of interdependence actions. Now, I have an example on this one, which I'll show in a second. But let me first tell you different types of emergence. So there are actually four that are talked about, but let me just talk about two, which sort of subsume the other two. So there's weak emergence. This is emergent behavior that cannot be predicted a priori via simulation. So in other words, I can't come up with a model, or sorry, I said that backwards. I can come up with a model that I can, or a viewpoint that I can explain after the fact, but I couldn't come up with a model that I can predict a priori beforehand. So that's called weak emergence. Strong emergence is where I've got emergent behavior that can't be predicted a priori or even after the fact. So this is much more difficult to describe because I actually, in some sense, I can't compute it, or I can't describe exactly how something happened. Now you're probably already asking yourself, give me an example of strong emergence, and I will. But let me talk about weak emergence first. Okay, so weak emergence, one example there would be the global financial collapse. You could probably agree with me that maybe if I had a very, very large computer and a very, very good model of human behavior, maybe I could have done a computer simulation to predict that behavior a priori, but probably not, partially because I'm dealing with human emotions under stress. Like, you're dealing with greed and fear. When that global financial collapse happened, people were talking about, well, it's a global financial collapse. That entered the lexicon at that point. People were like, the whole world is going to end. Sell everything. These types of cascading events. But maybe I couldn't have predicted that a priori. But now I can go back and explain it. They're very good. You go to like a financial well, any class in the business school that talks about this, they can explain it. We can explain it fairly well now in retrospect. Strong emergence, we can't. Now, what's an example? So here's the idea. Here's the fascinating thing about emergence. Okay, physicists, whenever they come up with models to try to describe behavior in, let's say a magnetic material or any type of material, they'll use what's called an icing lattice. And the basic idea is here, on the left, imagine I've got a structure. It could be like a crystalline structure, but I've got different, or I've got atoms that are in different spin directions. So I can put in, if I want to learn the macroscopic behavior, I go in and say, okay, this isn't the exact logic, but imagine a logic that I can encode here that says, if a spin A atom is next to a spin B atom, go into spin C. But if it's next to if a spin A is next to a spin C and also to a spin B, stay in spin A. So imagine having these very simplistic logical rules. You can, like I said, you can go into the paper and see what exactly they are. But it turns out, this is fascinating. It turns out that these physicists that wrote this paper that I referred to, or that I cited in this other paper, what they found is that if you encode basic logic between neighboring atoms in an icing lattice, they proved that the long-term behavior is computationally undecidable. It basically goes into some state, computationally undecidable means that I can't come up with some type of algorithm that will tell me that, 100 states from now, I'm going to be in this other state. It's going to take essentially a random path that I can't compute. Managing complexity. So let's say that I'm dealing with a system that's complex. It might even have emergent behavior. What are some of the recommendations, or some of the things I can do? I like this. To start out, here's a quote from Emerson. He said that as soon as there is life, there is danger. So like those dancing landscapes, as soon as I have life, I have some threat that I have to deal with. And because we live in a complex world, these complex interconnections, that danger is going to be there. I would say that increasingly more so. So it's not really an option in my mind that we learn how to deal with complexity, that we model it, that we try to harness it, foster the good aspects of complexity like resilience, robustness. What are some of the things we can do? Some methods for harnessing emergence. First of all, as I mentioned, understanding and modeling the agents. There are connections, interdependencies in these agent-based modeling tools. When we do design, making not only, like I said, high-level order and architecture and all that a design objective, but making robustness a design objective, especially if the landscape is changing. Including diverse agents and type mutations. So that's what I'm talking about, or as I talked about, the trade-off between exploration and standing pat. Now, how does that relate to an engineered system as we've talked about it? Well, you think of that classic example of Henry Ford. He made like how many millions of Model T Fords. And people kept saying, when are you going to change the model? When are you going to change the model? And he kind of refused to for like 5 years. And then finally, I think they were all the same color too. And finally he did. But the reason he was able to get away with that is because he didn't have a lot of competition yet. Couldn't get away with that now. So now this is a matter, it's also kind of comes into play whenever you talk about marketing. How much should we try to exploit an existing design versus how much should we put into trying to explore new markets? So that's what I mean by mutation. So it could be design mutations, watching out for and ensuring against tail risk. Now, I didn't mention this before, but of course, if you have a good agent-based model, you can try to do some, maybe if you have truly emergent behavior, maybe you can't actually do a simulation of certain types of things that could arise because of strong emergence, but you could potentially do simulations where you can determine various classes of behavior that you might come up against, and therefore feed that into a risk-based model. Now, Engineering 531 goes into risk, quantification of risk, but one of the ways you can mitigate risk is to insure against it. So in the financial markets, it's buying certain type of options. In the systems world, it might be like a literal insurance policy, reinsurance policy, or how you write contracts, things like that. And then another concept that's being explored in complexity theory or complexity science and emergence is diffusing this avalanche energy, like in the Purbach method, or like an actual avalanche. Is how do they sometimes prevent an avalanche from happening if there's going to be a lot of people going through there? Well, they might wait until they know there aren't any people out there and make the avalanche happen through explosives or whatever. So that's the idea. The same thing being talked about with earthquakes. In say California, if we know based on seismic activity, we have a good enough model that says there's going to be a huge earthquake, we think so. Is it possible to sort of diffuse that energy so it doesn't happen? Same analogy with complex systems.